Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. This is Kim Greenhouse. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim Ball, who's a renowned environmental consultant and former climatology professor at the University of Winnipeg. He has participated in our shows, the first climate shows that we ever did with Robert Felix and Joe Dalio. We invited him back to talk about peer review. We had a blockbuster show with him and Gavin Menzies. And the other day I was talking with Tim about the oceans. I had just completed a show on some things that are going on in the oceans with our Navy that had to do with the permission to kill off 11.x million mammals and natural habitats. And Tim started to discuss with me his work chasing Russian submarines and some deep level experience he has had in his work in the ocean and what goes on in the ocean with sonar and other types of impacts that we don't think about. He's also going to talk to us today about how important the ocean is as it relates to climate and how it impacts the CO2 that a lot of us are focused on. And we're just going to talk about all kinds of things, how it's easier to go to the moon than it is to go investigating under the sea. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Tim Ball to It's Rainmaking Time. Good day.
Good day. Thank you, Kim, and thanks for the opportunity.
Talk a little bit about what we talked about the other day. I learned a lot listening to you, and I'd like you to share about your work chasing Russian submarines. What were you doing? And give the context for the audience.
Okay, the context is, and of course there's always that question about, well, how is he qualified to talk about these things? He's a climatologist, and that's partly a reflection on something else we need to talk about, is that everybody's a specialist, but we live in a generalist world. But two things that I've done in my life. One was chasing Russians, or as they were then, Soviet submarines around the North Atlantic when I was with the Canadian Air Force. And I learned a great deal about the upper levels of the ocean, the area in which the submarines operate. And even though they're very sophisticated vehicles, that's a limited amount of the ocean because the depth crushes them once they get below about 1,000 feet. And in fact, the American government have spent enormous amounts of money building titanium, which is an enormously expensive metal, building titanium submarines to withstand those depths. And so I learned a great deal about that upper level of the ocean, the temperature structure of it, the sound transmission, and of course, one of the things that we used to do, and it was actually what made the job much more meaningful, was we would fly 18 and 20-hour patrols nonstop in a long-range aircraft. And in the middle of the night, we would drop a sound device that it was called a sonobuoy. This is a long tube that you threw it out the airplane. Vanes came up that span like a helicopter. And when it hit the water, the bottom plate flipped off and a microphone went down to whatever depth you'd preset it. And we used that, of course, for listening for submarines and listening for explosive devices that we dropped to echo back off the submarine. But we used them to listen to humpback whales as well. And one of the jobs that we did, they'll say, that made the job more interesting was that they taught us how to identify whales and the different species, and our job was to record them, the number in a pod and the direction they were moving and so on and so forth. So there were just so many fascinating things that I learned about that upper level of the ocean. And then once I got out of the military and lost my flying category because of a hearing problem, and I didn't want to fly a desk, so I went back to school. And because of that work, and then also because of flying search and rescue in the Arctic, which is another whole story.
I didn't know you did that. Every time I talk to you, I get more and more. I didn't know you flew search and rescue in the Arctic.
Yeah, I did 5 years of search and rescue right to the North Pole and all across Canada. And of course, when I started out, there was no GPS. In fact, just to tell you how primitive and how recent our knowledge of the world is, we used to fly up over Baffin Island and all of those places, and our maps had quite large areas that said terra incognita on them. Now, what that means is unknown land. And so this is in the 60s. So it tells you how recent we've been mapping even the surface of the Earth, and how little we actually know about the Earth, and we can talk about that with the oceans as well. But of course that got me learning about the Arctic climate. And of course the whole Arctic area is an incredibly fascinating area. But that got me into wanting to study weather and climate. So I went back to university. And there, of course, I discovered that the oceans were a very, very important part of the whole climate system. In fact, the interaction between the atmosphere and the oceans is an essential part of understanding how the weather changes and how the weather patterns develop. We can see that going on right now. For example, we've just coming out of an El Nino event, which is a large ocean current that influences the temperature around the world, and we're going into an El Nino, which is already driving temperatures down in the southern hemisphere. I mean, there are reports of below freezing temperatures in the Andes, in Bolivia, and so you get some idea of it. So the oceans, and particularly the upper levels of the ocean, are hugely important in understanding how the weather changes, and therefore how climate varies over time. So with all of those things coming together, it has led me to a tremendous interest in the oceans in total. And so that's the background for why I feel qualified to make some of the comments that things we're going to talk about today.
It's kind of disturbing that you have to lay that out in order to speak your experience and your expertise. But I'm glad you did it.
Well, of course, one of the things, Kim, is that it's a completely biased approach, because the skeptics are immediately challenged for their qualifications to talk about things, whereas people that are not skeptics are allowed to have all the views they want. And of course, the classic one is Al Gore, who sets himself up as an expert on climate and ridicules other people that dare to question him. And so, yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's a fact of, and in fact, it's a measure of how they've politicized these science issues, like the oceans and like the climate. And but it is necessary.
I want to go back to your experience listening to the humpback whales in our earlier conversation. I'm paraphrasing here, but you were speaking to me about the sonar and what happens to the mammals there and what they hear. And you were giving a certain perspective of something I thought was interesting. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, well, one of the ways you detect anything underwater is by sound. And of course, the whales and dolphins and other creatures that use the sonic method of detection, they send out a signal and then they receive the signal back. So they're very sensitive to sound, much like bats and use the same techniques. And so when we were trying to track down submarines, there were two things that we had to, well, several things, but two primary things was we learned that there were layers in the ocean determined by the water temperature. Everybody thinks that the ocean's temperatures are pretty well, just decreasing, warm at the surface and then decreasing with depth. Well, that's not the case at all. There can be multiple layers of a warmer layer and a cooler layer and so on. And one of the ways that the navies and I was in the Air Force, we determined this was by doing what was called a bathythermograph. And of course, that's simply a fancy term for graphing the temperature, the therm part of it, the temperature with depth. So you would drop a device that floated and sent down a thermometer, and as it went down, it recorded the temperature with depth, which you could then plot out to determine where the different temperature layers were. And of course, that then controls how the sound travels in the ocean horizontally. And just to give you an idea of how dramatic this can be, we could put down one of our listening devices, the sonobuoys that I talked about a little bit earlier, with the microphone down, and it could be above a layer of different water temperature, and a submarine could be just 80, 90 feet below that, yet you would never hear it.